Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today, and they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Hit the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is ecological economist John Gowdy. John joined me to explain what we can learn from ants. Apparently, ants, termites, and humans are the only species on this planet which are ultrasocial. That means living in extremely complex social organizations, which apparently leads to the decrease of individual complexity. What that means is, as a society gets more complex, individuals become simpler. Unfortunately, John and I experienced some technical difficulties during this interview, so it's a little bit shorter than it ordinarily would, and also a little less dynamic. It wasn't possible to go back and forth on a lot of these points, but thankfully he has a tremendous amount of knowledge on a wide-ranging set of topics, from ants and termites, as I said, to the economy, to social organization, to sustainability, etc. And we got into that through the lens of discussing his book, Ultrasocial, The Evolution of Human Nature and the Quest for a Sustainable Future. Fantastically as well, John peppered this podcast with lots of book recommendations. So grab a pen for this one, team. You will want to take notes, as I did throughout, about all these different books that have informed his thinking. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. If you love the episode, support the podcast at planetcritical.com or on Patreon. Becoming a paid subscriber or patron also directly supports my independent investigations into climate corruption around the world, exposing dangerous industry greenwashing and the world's worst climate fraudsters. If that's important to you, join the Planet Critical community who help make that happen. The link is in the description box below. And to those of you already supporting the podcast and my work, thank you so much. John, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to not be there, but be here, talk to you. Yeah.
So let's do a whistle-stop tour of your career, and then get into Ultrasocial, this fantastic book of yours.
Okay. Well, I started out academically, I started out in anthropology. Uh, well, maybe I should back up a little bit. I grew up in the American South in the wilds of the Arkansas Ozarks. So there weren't many people where I lived. So that got me, I think, into nature. I grew up with nature and hiking in the woods as a child and all that. And then my father got a job with the Food and Drug Administration in Washington. So I moved there, got a degree in anthropology from American University. And actually, I was in graduate school in anthropology. So that's sort of my first love. And I never really left it. But I got more and more into economics, realizing, how important that is in terms of policy. And economists, for better or worse, frequently for worse, sort of shape the policy agenda. It's you never hear of sort of the president's council, a sociologist or political scientist or whatever. It's all economics. So I went to not a particularly good school, but I had a really nice fellowship. I'd just gotten out of the Army. I had a small child, so I didn't. It was everything paid for. I didn't have to teach or anything else. But that was West Virginia University, and when I registered for classes, my advisor said, "Well, you should really take courses from this guy, Nicholas Rojewski-Rojan, who was a visiting professor there." I'd never heard of him. And I picked up his book, The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. This was the late 70s. And it really changed my life. I met him the next day, and he was one of the real pioneers in economic theory. Actually, he wrote papers in the 30s, very mathematical papers, sort of critiquing the psychological basis or the lack of the psychological basis of what's called Walrasian economics. Anyway, so that was a wonderful experience. He was there every other semester when I was at West Virginia. And so he and Kenneth Boulding were sort of the founding figures of ecological economics. And I'm afraid I've been president of the International Society, the American Society, but I've become increasingly disillusioned with the field for a number of reasons. Krzyzewski wrote a book called Energy and Economic Myths, and he had these sort of myths of economic theory. And one of them, one of the major myths, was the myth of salvation by markets. So he was very critical of like trying to price nature, put prices on things that really can't be priced. The main sort of obvious thing is irreversible pollution, irreplaceable natural resources, biodiversity, and so on. Future generations can't bid on these things. So, imagine
Mm.
how someone would bid, 50 years from now, and some of the species we're losing, the ecosystems, and so on. And so there was a paper published in
Mhm.
Ecological Economics in Nature in 1996, pricing nature. What's the value of nature? And it was like several $trillion. And that really started the field of ecological economics
Wow.
into this whole thing about putting a price on nature, putting a price on this or that species, and so on. And there are a lot of sort of interesting reasons for that. I think one thing is funding, and the other thing is publications. I mean, you can do these empirical studies and get them published because they're within the framework of standard theory. And the field, that branch has
Mm.
gotten a lot of funding from private foundations and probably the National Science Foundation and so on. So that's another story. I mean,
I'll bet.
and just in recent years, I've just become so aware of the importance of money and funding and power, not only in politics, but also in the academic agenda.
Can I interrupt
Okay.
quickly and ask? Because my understanding of ecological economics was that it was, understanding how to create an economy that can best also protect our ecology and our environment. But from what you're saying, it
Yeah.
sounds like ecological economics, perhaps it began as a way to understand the financialization of nature in order to save it, because those sound like quite disparate things.
Yeah, it didn't begin as that, but it sort of again, the field really got going in the see what was it? Sort of the 1980s, the mid 80s to late 80s, and it started out. There was a lot of articles. Kenneth Boulding, I mentioned Troshixi Roche and so on. Juan Martinez Allier. There are a lot of people who were Richard Norgard. I mean, I could go on, but they were developing economic theory, sort of
Mm.
critical of the standard economic paradigm. But then with these studies of pricing nature, then it just again that's when it started. I think really took off in the early 2000s. And again, if you're, I can understand why people would do that. If you're, system professor starting out, you write articles like that, you can get them published. They get attention. There's a better chance of getting funding
Mm.
than just being, critical of the standard paradigm. So yeah, it took a long time, and it's not, a
Mm.
monolith either. There's still people within ecological economics critical of that. Uh, Another thing I have a problem with is the notion of the steady state. That's become really central to economics. That was
Mhm.
Herman Daly has been the biggest exponent of that. And I'm, not to criticize Herman. I know him. I've known him for decades, and he's he's done more than anybody else to establish the field and really point out sort of the contradictions between economic growth and human well-being and environmental well-being. But the steady state is just it started as a critique of growth, but then it sort of morphed into this thing in itself. Okay, how do we define the steady state? What are the characteristics? Um, and then, what's the optimal size of the economy? What's the optimal population size? And my problem with that, it really is, does not have
Yeah.
an evolutionary perspective. It's sort of a steady state frozen in time. And you could somehow, like this Garden of Eden, sort of create this thing that will just, stay in a certain
Mm.
state and, be sustainable and not change. And so, anyway, you started focus on these things like optimal scale, and then you measure the economy. And that's one reason it got into these, I think, pricing nature and all that. But anyway, the real economy, the real environment, the real social structure is an evolving, constantly changing, complex system.
Which leads
So,
me on to this book that you've written, Ultrasocial. I pulled my favorite quote. So for everyone listening, Ultrasocial, John's book, The Evolution of Human Nature and the Quest for a Sustainable Future. And I pulled this little half sentence from the intro that says, increasing social complexity is associated with a decrease in individual behavioral complexity. Now that just seems fascinating.
yeah.
So could you begin by explaining the premise of the book, and then we'll get into that?
Yeah, the premise of the book, it's really based on the work of a social scientist named Donald Campbell, who, he died a couple of, well, no, at least 10 years ago, maybe 15. But he sort of established the basis for looking at the human economy as being an ultra-social system. And ultra-social means there are three kinds of organisms that have these systems: ants, termites, and humans, which he pointed out. I mean, those are the only organisms that have complex city states, incredibly complex divisions of labor, with dozens, hundreds of occupations. And
Mm.
I started this work with a colleague, Lisi Kroll, who's at SUNY Cortland. And in our work, we stress the importance of agriculture. People existed as hunter-gatherers for, depending on what you call human, for something like 300,000 years. Small societies, simple technology, but incredibly complex social systems, an incredible amount of knowledge of the environment and how to make a living, and so on. And there's, again, I always get accused of romanticizing hunter-gatherers. People really get their backs up if you say something nice about hunter-gatherers, because it calls into question civilization and writing and culture and all that. But anyway, so I really don't do that. It was sometimes a harsh existence. Um, anyway, but hunter-gatherers basically were, because of the nature of their economy, they lived off flows from the environment. They were egalitarian because by growing up in those cultures, you had the knowledge you needed to make a living. I mean, every person in that culture knew the plants to eat, they knew the life histories of plants and animals they hunted, how to get by. With agriculture, you began to get state societies after a few thousand years, and control of the means of production by an elite, and division of occupations into castes.
Can
You were
we
sort of born into occupations.
can we just focus for a second on, because I mean, to talk about hunter gatherers, it's thousands of years of social ways of organizing, and I'm sure not all of them
Right.
were organized in the same way. I mean, David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The
Oh,
Dawn of
yeah.
Everything, just came out, that showed the differences between how these societies were structured. So is it not a bit of a
Yeah.
generalization to say that they were all egalitarian, and that was due to the methods of how they got their food, their energy supply, essentially?
No, I don't think so. Uh, and I think, of course, they're very different because they lived in very different environments. I'll get back to Graeber's book in a minute. Um, but yeah, so they were, the Arctic people had different ways of living and hunting seals, and tropics, seacoasts had different cultures, and so on. But study after study has shown that they really, and again, egalitarian, you can get really picky on these things. Um, and let me just say,
Mm,
Krzyzewski-Rosen had a concept. When you analyze or do something, look at something analytically, you have to divide that something into categories. I mean, there are always overlapping boundaries. The transition to from hunting and gathering to state
mhm.
societies took thousands of years, 5 or 6 thousand years. So there are all kinds of
Yes.
intermediate stages. There's hunter gatherers that have the beginnings of hierarchy because they had a beginning of surplus, like the Northwest Coast Indians. But in general, you really can say they were
Mm.
egalitarian, certainly compared to modern cultures, and also sustainable. Because they had to be, they lived directly off flows from nature. So if they did anything to interrupt that flows, it quickly came back to bite them.
But there were so many different manifestations. I mean, there are
Yeah.
also hunter-gatherer societies that were not living in resource plenty areas and then would travel
Yeah.
and were particularly
Yeah.
warmongering and
Yeah.
then take the resources from their neighbors essentially. So I mean, don't we have to kind of define the term sustainable there?
Mm.
Because surely the sustainability was a part of the plentifulness. And then when there wasn't plentifulness, we have seen that
Yeah.
there was a lot of war and violence in order to get hands on resources, which doesn't seem particularly egalitarian.
Okay, I don't believe that's in Graeber's book too. I don't believe that either. There's been a lot of work on this. Hunter-gatherer societies, they had violence, but it was more interpersonal violence. It was like one person against another person. That was the nature of violence. Another person I think has done a real disservice on this stuff is Steven Pinker. He really plays fast and loose with the facts. He has this,
Mm,
I think it's in his book about hunter-gatherer violence, and he lists these 12 cultures. None of them are hunter-gatherers. They're all agriculturalists. The closest thing to a hunter-gatherer society was one group of Aborigines living in Sydney in the 1970s, with drugs, violence, colonialism, and all that. So you have to be really careful of this stuff. Um,
mm,
a glaring error in Graeber's book is the claim that hunter-gatherers had monumental architecture. And there was this site in Turkey that he and a lot of other people mentioned. It was a city-state of about 8 to 10,000 inhabitants, monumental architecture, permanent settlements, and all that. And he claims, based on the earlier work done there, that this was hunter-gatherers, which it was not. It was a full-blown agricultural society with grains and cultivation, storage of grains. And all you have to do is go to Wikipedia, and the name of the site the last word is Tepec, Tepec, something like I don't know, can't remember the name. It's a Turkish name. But so after the German archaeologist started excavating that site, 1994, he was there for about 10 years. And when he died, a new team took over and they dug a little bit deeper and found, it was a full-blown agriculture society like other similar societies in the area. So the idea that hunter-gatherers could live in a community of thousands of people in permanent settlements it's just ridiculous. I mean, it was implausible from the beginning, and I still can't understand how that took off. I mean, the Graeber's book was published last year, and this has been known for 10 years, 15 years, maybe longer. So there's a lot of sloppiness in the book. You really have to be careful and with the hunter-gatherer literature.
all right. I mean,
You know,
the what I know about the difference in tribal structures and the ability for the plentifulness and resources and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I've spoken with I have a
yeah,
few friends in Papua New Guinea, and their tribal history is that it was the
yeah,
tribes that were living on the coast that had access to plentiful resources that were very, very peaceful. And then it was the tribes in the mountains that
yeah,
did not have access to the same kind of resources, and were very, very violent and
yeah,
landed on the shores of Papua New Guinea and kind of
yeah.
wiped out these coastal tribes, these peaceful people. So it is also there in, indigenous knowledge and indigenous culture that there is this distinction between
Yeah.
hunter-gatherer societies depending on what they have access to.
Okay, first of all, those are not hunter-gatherers. The New Guinea people, you're probably talking about, are agriculturalists. They had settled communities, hierarchies, and so on. You have to be
Okay.
really careful. Start with the definition of hunter-gatherers, like immediate return hunter-gatherers, no
Mm.
agriculture, no domesticated animals, uh, constantly moving settlements, no permanent settlements. And yeah, with agriculture and surplus, then you can hunt, you can gather, you can steal from your neighbors. So there's certainly an incentive there, for and skirmishes between groups. But yeah, you have to be really careful. You have to start out with the strict definition of hunter gatherer.
So what defines a distinction between hunter-gatherer and agriculturalists? Is it surplus?
Well, it's agriculture. I mean, they took care of crops that really from beginning, you know, clear the land, plant the crops, tend them, keep animals out, weed them, and all that. So it's really creating a surplus, a permanent food supply. And when you have that, think of population growth. if you have an agricultural society, like, starting in the Middle East, you always want to produce more than you think you need because you can have bad weather, raids from neighbors taking out the crops. So in most years, you have more food than the population needs. When you have that, what happens? The population grows. And early, again, in the Middle East, especially, which most of the research has been done, there was a big advantage to having a larger size. You could protect your resources. You could raid other cultures, other societies, and get take over the surplus and so on. So the societies that had larger populations grew faster, outcompeted the others. So you start getting this built-in imperative for expansion and also exploitation of resources
Mm.
and people. And you get the beginning of hierarchies. And then again, eventually full-blown state societies.
So then let's get into full-blown state societies. What can we learn from ants and termites? And also, I mean, what can we learn from them in terms of how to create a sustainable future with such a large population and such high energy demands?
Yeah. So the similarities are, with those societies is that the whole culture, the whole economy, the whole system is geared toward producing surplus. Whether it's ants, termites, or humans. The big difference between humans and ants and termites, and this sounds surprising, humans have castes, hereditary wealth. Ants and termites do not. So they don't, ants and termites, they don't have heredity. The queen lays all the eggs and so on. Yeah, there's the fascinating
Mm.
thing to me about these systems, think of a beehive. We call it an ultrasocial system or a super colony or a super organism, but it's really not an organism. I mean, there's no there. I mean, a beehive, there's no central control. The queen is just an egg laying machine. So if you look at the central, how does the thing work? I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Sort of my go-to ultrasocial species are leafcutter ants, and they have this really this civilization, and it's all based on genetics. When a new colony is started, a queen with fertilized eggs goes and finds a place, digs a hole, lays the eggs. Those eggs hatch out and the first generation takes care of the next generation, and they have an amazing ability. All these occupations, somehow the colony knows what kind of ants to produce: soldiers or workers or leaf cutters or explorers or
Mm.
carriers or whatever. They even have like a kind of untouchable ant that cleans up the waste from the underneath the colony, and they're sent down, and once they leave the colony to clean up the waste, they're not allowed to come in contact with other ants.
Wow.
I mean, there's so many parallels. Ants have organized warfare between different ants. There's a kind of ant called Argentine ant in California, and these two super colonies have been fighting for decades. They estimate that something like 1 trillion ants a year might be killed in battles between these two colonies. The Pentagon actually studies these things for tactics to use in battles. Yeah, it's amazing. So they have suicide bomber ants that have this chemical in their bodies, and they go into the enemy lines and blow themselves up. I mean, it's astounding. It really is. But somehow, again, you think of all when a study of chimpanzees, they have some small trait that might be like a sense of fairness or so on, which is fine. But you have these the ants who are so similar to humans in their social structure, but people sort of dismiss them as being mildly interesting but not relevant to understanding human society. I think that's beginning to change. Yeah, you mentioned before one characteristic of an ultrasocial system is social complexity is associated with individual simplicity. So if you think of again an ant colony being some sort of superorganism that's not an organism that acts as if it's optimally organizing the different occupations and so on. Well, it takes information from individuals, individual ants in that case in that colony. For example, if the ant colony is choosing a new site for a nest, somewhere to move, then the ants actually vote vote with their feet. They're 6 feet. They go explore and try to find a new nest site. Then they report back. And the site with the most votes,
Mm.
quote from the ants, that's where the colony moves. But you need that information to be as simple as possible. Is this site a good site or not? Yes or no. You don't want some sort of long, detailed analysis or committee report 25 pages long. Should we do this or not? Yes or no. Um, and so there's a fascinating thing that happened with humans after state societies, and that's that our brains started to shrink. The human brain has lost something like 10 or 15% of its size very recently, actually, in the last 3 or 4 thousand years. And the same thing has happened in ants. Ants that live, the larger the society ants live in, the smaller their brains also. They've also shrunk by about 10%. And so individual simplicity seems to
Wow.
facilitate this collective consciousness. So, and this is most of the stuff written about sort of human societies and the social brain and all that. It's very positive, but I don't really see it as being positive. I'd rather be smarter and take a few more risks than have everything done for me. So yeah, but the human brain is very expensive in terms of energy.
It seems to me then, I'm completely riffing here, that perhaps part of the problem then is if increasing social complexity means individual simplicity, part of the problem is this hierarchy, and that perhaps some
Mm.
individuals want to maintain their right
Yeah,
to complexity
yeah.
and autonomy and individuation at the expense of others. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, the hierarchy in human society sort of throws everything off. There's a lot of really good books written about that. Especially, I was impressed by a book by Walter Scheidel called The Great Leveler. And he talks about this idea of the circulation of elites, which goes way back. Sort of after when hierarchical societies develop, you get controlled by, call them oligarchs, whatever you want to call them, the 1%. And there's always a battle, according to Scheidel, between, call it enlightened self-interest. We have to give, the masses something, keep them relatively happy. And then on the other side, those who will, take everything that isn't nailed down. And you're certainly seeing this now played out through the West, Great Britain and the U.S. Especially. I mean, the U.S. you have sort of the enlightened self-interest represented by the Democrats, and then sort of the new they call them populists, but
Mm,
they're really driven by right-wing billionaire money. What Tea Party now morphed into this whole
mhm,
Trump phenomenon. So you really see
mm,
that playing out. And Walter Scheidel and also Thomas Piketty and others argue that you get these periods, something like 70 years, 80 years, I think, or 100 years. You get this turnover of elites, sort of reshuffling the decks. The great leveler, Scheidel, again, he goes back 10,000 years, but you have plagues, wars, famine, massive crop failures, and so on. And that reshuffles the deck. The old order is swept away, and then you get this dynamic new order coming in, and things are very prosperous for a while until the oligarchs over time retake power. That's probably what's happened since World War II.
mm,
The first part of the last century. I mean, imagine that you were born in 1900. Go through World War One, Great Depression, World War II. I mean, by the time you're 50, it's like, my God, what kind of society did I grow up in? So the end result of that after World War II and the destruction of Europe, Japan, and so on, you had a new order coming in. The old guard was swept away. The entrenched cultures and institutions were swept away. So you had this period of really dynamic growth from the end of World War II until the 70s or early 80s. And then things seemed to started going backwards in terms of after World War II, there was increasing equality, wages were going up. And then, the oligarchs, I'm going to get comments on this, retook power, took charge of things, tax cuts for themselves, and cut back on social programs and so on. So now we seem to be going down the other side. income inequality in the U.S. is, I think, the worst it's ever been. I think it's worse than in the 20s, or the
Mhm.
so-called Gilded Age. But yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating to sort of. I mean, I like to look at these, very general, sort of sweeping things.
Sure. I mean, the first thing that I think of when you say that, though, is that yes, there was the boom after World War II, and things were certainly getting better in the West, but also at the expense of many other nations and populations around the world.
Oh yeah.
So at what point, I mean, when we're talking about this superorganism, at what point do we also localize the examples? I mean, should we now always be looking at the big picture? Or should we be looking at
Uh,
national economies in the same way that you might examine different ant and termite colonies?
yeah, that's another really good question. It's kind of let me sort of get into this. Um, there are a group of ants, certain kinds of ants, like Argentine ants, that have really colonized the whole globe. They've turned into these super colonies. For example, Argentine ants, and they travel on ships, around the world and so on. Again, I think they started in Argentina, but they have sort of sub colonies in Australia, Europe, North America. You can take an Argentine ant from a colony in Japan, put it in the U.S., and it's accepted, fully accepted. And this is unusual. And
Wow.
they seem to have suppressed this competitive gene or allele, I don't know which one it is, that makes them accepted. Okay, there's been a lot of studies of these ants, and they think that when an ant uh, supercolony like this moves into a new area, then there's a tremendous advantage for cooperation. All these new resources there to be exploited. The larger the colony, you can take advantage of economies of scale, economies of scope, economies of size, and so on
Mm.
until resources are exhausted. Been fascinating studies on islands. Like there's an island, I think it's in the Seychelles, that was colonized. The first Argentine, no, they're called crazy ants. It's another species of ants. But these ants colonized this island beginning around 1997. By 2004, they occupied the whole island. But then the super colony collapsed as they took over the whole island, exploited the resources, and then the returns to cooperation, were reduced to the point where it didn't pay anymore. So they splintered into these smaller colonies. And, that may be what's happening now with globalization. After World War II, there was a tremendous advantage for
Mm.
cultures cooperating, countries cooperating, and so on because of the tremendous growth. Resources become scarcer, and we seem to be now into this period of splintering. Splintering at groups in all over the world are at each other's throats now that used to compete or used to cooperate. More conflict
Mm.
between countries, and so it seems to be going back the other way. I mean, this is not necessarily a bad thing in the long run. I think it's, again, these transition periods are the problem. But, yeah, but anyway, there are all
Well,
kinds of these
I
fascinating sort of analogies or parallels.
the thing though that concerns me when thinking about the splintering of globalization, it's not the splintering of globalization in itself which is concerning, but that splintering of cooperation. Because with the urgency of the climate crisis,
Yeah,
the ecological crisis, the energy crisis, the economic crisis, I mean, the level of cooperation that it is going
yeah,
to take to actually find and implement
yeah,
solutions and necessarily contract economies and contract energy demands, this seems like the worst moment in history, really,
yeah,
to be losing our global cooperation.
yeah.
Otherwise, how are we going to be able to create a sustainable future?
You're absolutely right, and I'm getting more and more pessimistic by the day. I don't know. I think there's a quote by Woody Allen, something like, "No matter how cynical you get, it's hard to keep up." I mean, I think I've caught up. So yeah, I just, I can't see us doing much about climate change. I mean, and to think about climate change, when it hits and starts really affecting people, which it already is, it really won't be about climate change. For example,
Mhm.
the war in Ukraine now. It's just these complex systems. You can see the effect of the war on food supplies and cooperation, supply
Yeah.
change, and on and on. So I think where the rubber meets the road with climate change will be the effect on agriculture. I mean, agriculture was impossible until the Holocene about 10,000 years ago because of the instability of the climate in the Pleistocene, the last 2 million years or so. And if you look at the fluctuation in temperatures, decade to decade or year to year, Pleistocene, it looked like this. Then the Holocene, it's really level like that. And that's what we're really mucking around with. I think at the bottom of the ice ages, the temperatures were something like 4 or 5 degrees Celsius cooler, and we're probably headed for 3 or 4 degrees Celsius warmer uh, by the end of this century or shortly thereafter. And the big thing will be the fluctuations, the unpredictability of climate. And you're already beginning to see that with crop failures in different places around the world. And that'll manifest
Mm-hmm.
itself in like social instability, migration, on and on. These problems just sort of, snowball and escalate, and they spill off, from one thing to another. I think in terms of policy, you just can't deal with these things in isolation either. I mean, it's not just overpopulation. It's not just fossil fuel overexploitation. It's not just climate change. It's not just inequality. It's all these things rolled into one.
Exacerbating each other.
Another thing sort of jumped out to me in terms of looking at state society is the role of government. There's a very good economist now called Mariana Mazzucato. He's an American Italian, no, an American Italian who lives in the UK, I think. Uh, but she writes a lot about the role of government in modern societies, and we have this false dichotomy between like the government and the free market and so on. But markets can exist without governments. If you look at every developed economy, the government's role in the economy is really dominant. And in the U.S., it's something like 34% of GDP is comes from government. Norway, it's a little bit higher, 38%. France, it's much higher than that. But all these countries, the government really funds projects that can't be done by the private sector. There's some great, like Elon Musk, for example, this American billionaire who goes around, talking about free enterprise and denouncing government interference. Well, Tesla was actually started with government money. I mean, he got his start with the financial bailout in 2009. His company got a $440 million loan from the government to get started, and now half the profit from Tesla comes from selling carbon credits. Another government project. The healthcare system, the military-industrial complex, energy system, and on comes from government spending. It's just a matter of where the money goes.
Mm. I wonder then what a free market would look like without it being propped up by state, and then also by disseminating those power structures, which are social relationships between oligarchs, whether they're politicians or businessmen. I wonder then what that would do to the
Yeah,
ultrasocial superorganism.
yeah, it couldn't exist. The human organism couldn't exist without massive government spending and amassing capital and surplus to keep the thing going. There's
Mm.
a really fascinating book by Philip Murawski, an economist, about neoliberalism, and he really just one of the first people to point out that neoliberalism of Friedrich Hayek and so on, um, they don't they're not against the government. I mean, they recognize the importance of the government in the economy. It's just that in propping up the superorganism, and I think Hayek actually uses the term. I mean, he really believes that the human economy was a superorganism. He thought it was a good thing, and people should submit to the will of this thing. But yeah, the economy just couldn't exist without the government.
So what is next then? Is you said you feel pessimistic about the future, but nonetheless, what kind of structures or paradigms do we need to put into place in order to constrain the exponential growth of this economic superorganism, and also have that paradigm not dictate the well-being of people and planet, and have it the other way around?
Well, first of all, take a really long-term perspective. I mean, the system will change. I mean, it can't go on like this. Resources getting scarce, complexity is just getting too heavy, too complicated to sustain. So if you looking ahead, a couple hundred years, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll have a better world in 200 years. It's just, maybe 100 years. It's just a matter of getting there.
Really? I mean, but we're going to increase our warming by 3 or 4 degrees.
Yeah, agriculture won't be possible. The population will shrink either, one way or another. And yeah, it'll be again if it doesn't, if that 3 or 4 degrees warmer, the ecosystems will change. Populations, I think, will go into simpler societies, simple agriculture or hunter gatherers or whatever. Um, yeah, and again, it's not a hunter gatherers were not. It wasn't a Garden of Eden. It was a harsh life, a rough life, and so on. But in some ways, it's again sustainable, egalitarian. I think that'll be better. But getting there is going to be a problem, and I just can't see that we'll do anything about climate change, anything meaningful. But on the other hand, because what's the other problem? So the problems with the human economy, like inequality and so on, we know how to deal with those problems. There have been successful policies to make societies better. The Scandinavian countries, uh, even a country in Africa like Rwanda it's amazing what they've done there after this horrible genocide that happened 25 years ago. So, and strong leadership, but in terms of making the world socially a better place, we know what to do. It's just a matter of, fighting the powers that be to give up some of the surplus to make the world a better place for humans. And we know better health care, universal health care, more money for education, and also protecting what's left of the natural world. E.O. Wilson has called for half the earth to be set aside for nature. So expand the national parks and so on. And again, setting aside these places for nature, it doesn't mean keeping humans out. It means keeping markets out. Don't let the markets go into these places
Mm.
and you know create markets for elephant tusks or ivory or whatever, pangolins. I mean, on and on. So we can make the world a better place until some better system comes.
Great. That is such a wonderful sentence. It's not about keeping humans out, it's about keeping markets out. That is such an important distinction, increasingly so, I think. John, I'm aware because of the technical difficulties that we're having, I'm going to wrap us up 10 minutes earlier than I normally would. First of all, where can people get their hands on a copy of your book?
It's at Cambridge University Press. You can order it directly from them, I think. Amazon, if a lot of people don't, they're sort of shying away from Amazon now, but it's pretty much available. There are probably used copies flying around now. It was published in October, and have people free to email me if they want. John Gowdy at earthlink.net.
John Gowdy at earthlink.net. I will put that on the Planet Critical website so people can email you. And my final question for you then, John, is who would you like to platform?
Yeah, well, you might talk to Lisi Krall, Lisi Krall, Krall, and she's at SUNY Cortland. Another person, very good ecological economics, is John Erickson at the University of Vermont. There's another guy, James Trinello, at Boston University, and he's an ant specialist, but he's also gets into human social evolution, so on. And he's done a lot of work on the shrinking human brain and relating that to what's happening in ants. So
Fascinating. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Listen, John, thank you so much for your time today. It was so great speaking with you. Thanks for coming on the show.
it's great talking to you, and thanks for what you're doing a wonderful work.
Thank you so much. If you want to get your hands on a copy of John's book, I've put links in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is also in the description box below. Supporting the podcast also directly supports my climate corruption investigations. So, a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community. None of my work would be possible without you. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.